Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly, your source for policy, politics, and fresh ideas. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, Donald Trump's war on the federal workforce.
It's not only about trying to get rid of federal employees, but more fundamentally, it is about the very process of asserting the president's power over the executive branch of government.
Our guest is Don Kettl, Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. He is a frequent contributor to the Washington Monthly and co-author of the book Bridge Builders: How Government Can Transcend Boundaries to Solve Big Problems. Welcome, Don. It's so great to have you on the show.
It's great to be with you and have a chance to talk about these hugely interesting issues here.
So first, let's very quickly set the stage here for our listeners and viewers. So as of this conversation, we are a couple weeks out from inauguration, and Trump has already issued this barrage of executive orders aimed at taming the federal workforce. So if I've got the list right, he's banned the telework, suspended DEI activities, paused public communications at a lot of important agencies. He's reassigned or fired senior staff at multiple agencies, including DOJ, the State Department. And now, most recently, we've had this bizarre deferred resignation offer. So first of all, am I missing anything from this list? And then number two, what do you see as kind of the big themes behind these orders? What is he trying to accomplish? What message is he trying to send?
Yeah, and that may be about it for the second at this point, but who knows what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes as we're talking. Actually, just before we started, I saw a blast that came through saying that they're encouraging federal employees to take private sector jobs, and so don't wait to think about getting bought out. We're going to push you out the door if we have the chance. And so what's going on there is extraordinary. And in addition to that, in the background, of course, is the order to freeze federal spending for grants, which don't deal directly with the issue of federal employees, but which provide a kind of backdrop of the broader strategy of what they're up to. And it's that broader strategy that I think is very important to pay attention to. If you haven't already, I'm sure that everybody has their dog-eared copy of Project 2025 right by their bedside. And if you don't, you can buy two of them, and you don't have to worry about getting dumbbells to exercise your wrists and your biceps, because they weigh 5 pounds each. And so It's extraordinarily detailed thing in 900 pages. But go to your favorite section, or your favorite place where you read Project 2025, and pick up the chapter written by Russell Vought. And Vaught's chapter, which deals with not just the presidency, but the executive branch. And it begins with an argument that the president has the power under the Constitution to exercise the power under Article 2 to direct the executive branch in the way in which it operates. And then he quickly gets to Madison and other quotes by the founders laying the foundation for this. So if you're trying to figure out what this is all about, this could not be more fundamental to the basic operation of the American constitutional system. It's not only about trying to get rid of federal employees, but more fundamentally, it is about the very process of asserting the president's power over the executive branch of government, and arguing that the president has that power to do what it is the president believes is important, which then leads, he believes, that is Russell Vought believes, as well as other people who are helping to shape the policy, what they believe, that the president has the power to make all federal employees at will. And to sort of dig more deeply in a couple pieces for evidence. Again, I know that you have your collection of White House executive orders and instructions dog-eared too, but go back to the one on the senior executive service, where it says in a sentence that all members of the senior executive service have the responsibility to exercise the laws as the president defines them, and that therefore they ought to be at will. And it's not quite as it's put, but that's what it really means. And then go to the argument that's made in support of this new schedule in the federal service that would convert federal people who are involved in issues of policy to a special new schedule, which then would allow them to be dismissed. And there's a gem of a paragraph in there that talks about the president's power It's the responsibility of all members of the federal service to follow the law and their oath that says that they're responsible to the Constitution, and that the Constitution gives the president the power to set policy, and anybody who doesn't follow that can be dismissed. So this is huge. This is enormous, beyond the incredibly important details like trying to abolish DEI offices. This is as big as it gets.
Well, I think people who are just tuning in to what's going on may know, that other presidents have run against the bureaucracy. Jimmy Carter was critical. Reagan said government is the problem. Clinton said the era of big government's over. That there's always this thing of we're gonna take on the bureaucracy and tame it and so forth. But it's pretty clear to me that this is a kind of difference in kind. This is something unprecedented. Do you feel like talking about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I've been suggesting to people is that there have been efforts to try to say, well, this is just like what, and then fill in the blank, what so and so did. And this is unlike anything that any president's ever really tried in terms of scale and scope and detail. This is, so if you say this is just like X, that you're just missing what it is that's happening. The closest thing in history that I can see is the effort during the Nixon administration to try to both create what they called a loyalty program and make it possible to get rid of people who were viewed as disloyal, to expand the president's power of impoundment, and to engage in other kinds of strategies to enhance the power of the executive. But this is Nixon on steroids. And it's important to remember that Nixon was beaten back on the loyalty program, and that was part of the Watergate investigation, and that was part of the justification for the effort to try to remove him from office, and that Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act, which made it impossible for the president to impound money. But they're going right after both of those things, and then more on top of that, including an authority to just pick pieces up of federal agencies and either abolish them or send them to another department. That's part of the argument about what they're going to do, they say, with the Department of Education. So this is unlike anything that we've seen. And so the one thing that I would leave with everybody is just don't try to sit and think about this in terms of anything that anybody has ever done. This is new in itself and needs to be considered as in a fundamental way about what it is that this administration is trying to do to reshape the power of the president.
Wow. So aside from the Constitution, which you've mentioned, I mean, yeah.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
But you remember that? But how many kids have actually read it? And has even Elon Musk read it? And it's the kind of thing that it's probably worth going back and picking that up and sort of reading through, especially Article 2, which is sort of an interesting little piece of the document.
But there are also statutes in place, right? I mean, how is anything that Trump is doing now legal under laws that Congress has enacted to protect itself and its power?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we're going to see, I think, is the question of how much of what it is that's been put into law the Congress is going to try to respond to. To what degree is Congress going to put up its back and say that we're going to protect what we view as legislative and congressional prerogatives? And so we've seen one test of that with the inspectors general and the firing of them, and some members of the Senate in particular saying, it's not legal. But what's happened is that who's pressing that case? The president supposedly has to give 30 days notice and allow Congress to act, but there's no sign Congress is going to do anything. So it's been met with more of a whimper on that. So this is there are laws that the administration has already shown that it's willing to push aside, but it's also, I think, also important to recognize that it's been extraordinarily clever in being able to use the laws that actually exist. So I think it's not only just they have to challenge laws as they are, but to use the laws as they're written. The great example is the effort to try to create paid leave programs, which the the administration sent out as a OPM document on the first day, which is something given all the rest that was going on was largely missed. But it said that the president's got the power and administrators have the power to put employees on paid leave if their programs and responsibilities are being downsized or diminished or eliminated. And so this was used in the past just for relatively small scale cases, for relatively small numbers of employees, for relatively small scale actions. And instead, what we see now is that the assertion of an authority to be able to put lots and lots and lots of people on paid leave, and to be able to do that as a way to try to ease them out. The federal government does not have a broad scale reduction in force program until now. And what that action by OPM has done is to suggest that, yeah, we can do that, and here's how. And how this is rolled out? Well, it's rolled out in the effort to try to eliminate DEI programs throughout the federal government, because they didn't actually shut down DEI. They just have been working to eliminate the people in charge of administering it. No people, no program. And so how can they do that? Well, they put the people involved in those programs on paid leave as a way to try to ease them out the door. And so check that one off as a way to try to accomplish that. It's also the way in which they're talking about engaging in the buyout that isn't a buyout, to try to offer incentives for federal employees to resign now and get paid through the rest of the fiscal year. But that's blowing up in their face, because it turns out that we only have an appropriation through March 14th at this point. There's a continuing resolution, and there's this little thing that sometimes some people are taught in graduate school about the Anti-Deficiency Act, a boring kind of name, but the basic idea here is that Congress has already passed a law that says that the president may not spend any money that hasn't already been appropriated by Congress, which comes from the sort of, well, duh category of constitutional law. But the problem is that agencies are only funded through March 14th. And so how can you make a promise now to put people on paid leave in April and May and June, July and August and September, if in fact that money hasn't been authorized by Congress yet? So this is kind of blowing up in their face too.
I'm sure we're all shocked at the idea that Donald Trump might make a promise that he can't keep, or has no intention to keep, or anything else. I think it's important to look also at the kind of core of this whole thing, this idea that we have this bloated federal bureaucracy, dozens of flugelmen and thimble riggers hanging around doing nothing. You wrote a piece in the Washington Monthly's most recent issue, pointing out the federal bureaucracy has not grown at all over quite a period of time, during which federal responsibility has grown. I mean, I think that would be worth pointing out to people.
Yeah, and that's exactly the case. People imagine this enormous bloated federal bureaucracy with people sitting around doing heaven only knows what. I still remember a kind of tongue-in-cheek report by one reporter on a TV station back in one transition period, and just drove down Constitutional and Independence Avenue in Washington and pointed the camera at the federal buildings and just shaking his head, said, "What do all those people do?" And there was a sense that this gross, nameless, faceless bureaucracy, and there's got to be so much waste in there to begin with, because we see all these kinds of problems that exist. I mean, how horrendous could this be? And so there's been this underlying argument that, wow, we just need to get rid of these people. But a couple of things that are interesting that makes for great rhetorical stuff. But what has the news media been focusing on since the horrific crash in the Potomac between an Army helicopter and an American Airlines jet? And it's that, wow, the control tower was understaffed. And we have no idea, as we're taping this, whether or not that had anything whatsoever to do with the crash. But the news media, as that is the bright, shiny object in the story that they're chasing down. And so federal employees are just wasteful, and the employment is bloated, and it all is such a strong argument. So wait a minute, we didn't have enough controllers in the tower. One more nugget worth pointing out is that, the way to try to deal with this problem, of course, is to have, we need to have a buyout. So we need to try to get rid of feds. We need to just get them out the door. And one of the things that happened back during the Clinton administration when there was a buyout was that it was so moderately successful at getting people to leave the federal government. And then agencies turned around and discovered, wait a minute, some of the people who left have skills that we needed. And so what are we going to do now? Well, the only thing to do is to hire private contractors to come back in and to replace the federal employees who left. Didn't happen across the board, but happened in a lot of cases. And of course, private contractors are never cheaper than the employees who left. And the irony of ironies is that in some cases, the contractors who were hired back were the very people who used to work for the federal government who took the buyout. And so the federal government paid for their salaries and then paid for the buyout and then paid to hire them back at a higher price than would have been the case otherwise.
Actually, can we go back to the point that you made about the contractors? Because that is something that you also
Sure.
wrote about for the monthly.
Right.
And one of the things you note is just the sheer size of what is basically now a shadow government of contractors. Can you talk a little bit more about how many contractors are we talking about? And we are talking about people like Elon Musk too, right?
Yeah,
These are the people
exactly.
who
Yep.
we've outsourced government to over the years through privatization. If you could talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that.
And one important factoid is that we spend more money on contractors outside the government than we spend on the payroll and benefits for federal employees. So it's big and
Wow.
it's huge. How much bigger? How much huger? And the answer is we don't exactly know. Why? Because the federal government doesn't keep its books in a way that allows us to answer the question. Paul Light over the years has been doing some great research on this, and as best we can tell, there may be something like 5 times as many contractors out there doing work for the federal government as there are government employees. But it's sort of a best guess kind of thing, because again, we don't keep track of this. How many contracts does the federal government issue? And I was looking that up yesterday, and it turns out that the numbers in the many tens of thousands in terms of the amount of contracts that we have. How many contractor employees do we have? And the answer is we don't know. But one of the things we do know is that the contracts are everywhere. And it turns out that, for example, Elon Musk, as you pointed out, has a major contract from NASA for SpaceX to engage in commercial space flight, which is part of the new strategy. It sort of makes sense because NASA got out of the business of essentially hiring contractors on its own to be able to build things according to NASA specifications. Now it's trying to create competition among different companies so that they can buy what they want and get what they need in terms of space travel. But Elon Musk is getting a lot of contracts in that way, and and of course he wants to be able to operate as free as possible from federal regulations. But 2 points so worth pointing out there in terms of just the complexity of managing these contractor systems. On one launch, his launch pad literally blew up. The launch of the rocket was successful, but the concrete pad underneath it was blown to smithereens because of the sheer power of the rocket. It's an incredibly powerful device that we've never seen before. And it just blew the pieces of the pad everywhere, including big chunks that flew into a nature preserve. And so to be able to conduct subsequent launches, Musk had to promise that he would create a pad that was stronger and wouldn't endanger the environment, which he sort of thought was ridiculous. So the question is, what kind of regulation should we have over our contractors to ensure that they deliver high quality goods at good prices and that produce the results that they want and don't do other things that we don't want them to do? Like, for example, second part of the story, I launched a few weeks ago where the rocket took off, and they have this amazing device that as the rocket returns to the pad, this device on the launch tower that catches the rocket on the way back in. If you haven't seen it, it's an amazing video to dig up. Fascinating to watch. But it was designed to put a launch vehicle. The launch vehicle was designed to put a spacecraft into orbit, and so they had a test flight, and the spacecraft blew up. And it blew up over the Caribbean, Florida and the Caribbean, to the point that it was raining debris down. And so the FAA had to clear the airspace out from underneath it so that airplanes flying in the neighborhood didn't get hit by the debris from the spacecraft that had exploded. So that's sort of a bad idea. You don't want to have spacecraft that blow up and endanger international air travel. And so now there's a question of what kind of regulations are appropriate and important for ensuring the safety of everybody else through the launch of contracted out commercial space vehicles.
Well, another curveball that's hitting the bureaucracy right now is apparently a project to bring political conformity to civil servants. We're seeing a kind of loyalty program, Nixonian on steroids, I guess, set up there, and employees are even having their social media accounts. They're called to account for tweets or so forth. What's the downstream effect of this, as far as you can project?
In some cases, you don't have to look too far downstream to see the implications of this, because there are cases where federal employees have been worried about whether or not, in fact, there's inspection of their accounts, which, as we know from a hit list that was prepared before the transition, that certain employees of the Department of Homeland Security were discovering that that there were investigators paid by an association connected with the Heritage Foundation were putting them on the hit list because, in part, of things that they had posted on LinkedIn pages. And so, and those cases, there were employees who just took their LinkedIn pages down. There are instances of federal employees now limiting access to their Facebook accounts to make sure that nobody can look and see what it is that they're actually doing. There's that level of intimidation and fear. Now, this gets into set of really tough questions. Do federal employees have the responsibility to execute the law as, in fact, they've been instructed? I spent some time in the VA, and I still remember the moment when I raised my right hand and took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And to this day, it sort of sticks with me because it reminded me of my responsibilities. And I'm not allowed in any kind of position, if I'm a federal employee, to be a freelancer. And so I get that for sure. But then at what point does somebody step back and define what accountability looks like? To what degree am I to be responsible and accountable to the president? The answer is, well, of course, but there's also accountability to the law as it's written. And to what degree do I need to be accountable to the public, who, after all, is paying the bills? And so what we've got now is an assertion of accountability that sweeps almost everything else aside, except for accountability to the law as the president defines it.
Yeah. Now, to the extent that the administration is able to use loyalty oaths and whatever other mechanisms to drive out senior, competent people and replace them with loyalists who may have loyalty really as their only qualification, what long-term impacts do you see on kind of the effectiveness and competence of the federal workforce and the federal government in the long term when we lose all this experience?
Yeah, I wrote a book not too long ago called Experts in Government from Cambridge University Press. And I was kind of curious about exactly that question, about where did this deep state idea come from and what could be and has been done to try to replace it. And I went back to ancient Rome and ancient China and traced the question of loyalty and expertise from the ancients to the present, and came away with one important conclusion with an interesting example. And the important conclusion is no government in the history of the world has ever been successful at focusing itself solely on loyalty, because sooner or later the problems of expertise jump up to bite them. And to tell you what, just as an example, you wouldn't want to sort of put me, if I'm loyal to the president as my primary qualification, in the control tower and be in charge of trying to land airplanes. That'd be a bad idea, because I can tell you, I personally have no idea how to do that. Loyalty is not going to get you very far at a job like that. Go back to history, though, for one really interesting anecdote. Back in the good old days, the emperors relied on the Praetorian Guard to guard them and protect them. These were the most loyal soldiers that they had. They were handpicked to try to guard the emperor. And there are lots of movies that play off of that as a plot line. Well, Caligula did that as well. And turned out that he annoyed everybody so much that his own Praetorian Guard turned on him and assassinated him, and stuck him through a bunch of times with swords, and he ended up losing his life because he bet the farm on loyalty.
Well, as a final thought, at some point we have to hope, and for planning purposes, we have to assume that we will emerge from this particular nightmare and be dealing with the aftermath. And when we think about that, what changes can we make to the existing civil service system that will kind of make it more resilient, make it harder to uh, outsource and so forth, but at
Yeah.
the same time retain the people that we want?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things I've been spending a lot of time working on is what I've been calling the kind of over the hill and around the corner kinds of questions. That what happens in the longer term, and it's based on the presumption that sooner or later we're going to get to a point where what what's happening now is not going to work. It's to use a different metaphor. The great movie of Thelma and Louise, and Thelma and Louise at the end. For those who haven't seen the movie, grab hands with each other in a convertible and floor it and head for a cliff, and their plans to go over the side. I mean, with this administration, what's going to happen is that either they will go over the cliff and there will be a bunch of debris at the bottom that they'll have to put back together again, or they will get to the edge of the cliff and decide that going over it is not a good plan. They want to slam on the brakes. So in either case, what happens then? The dirty, awful secret about the civil service, if you talk to anybody from the right or the left or the middle, that they'll whisper to you is the current system is broken. It is just broken, and there's some who say it's irretrievably broken. So I wouldn't go quite that far, but I think we need to redo the basics of the civil service. And we need first and foremost to focus on purpose and mission. That, for example, you can have DEI as a strategy to make sure that you create a system that is more responsive to the public because it looks more like the public. But the primary goal that we need to think about in fixing the civil service is to focus on the very process of understanding the results that we want government to accomplish. And everything needs to focus on that. The second point is then we've got to fix hiring. And we've got a system right now where it takes 3 times as long to hire in the federal government as it does in the private sector. And if you're a potential employee and you're thinking about, do I go work for a private company or work for the federal government, the long process itself may very well decide that for you. And a lot of people just can't afford to wait that long for a job offer or to have a job offer confirmed. So we need to fix that, and the ways of being able to do that. We need to, for example, create as the Biden administration did pretty successfully, something called, and it doesn't got much publicity because it's got such an awful name, but pooled hiring. That is, if I'm an accountant and I'm applying for a job and I can demonstrate that I've got the competence and my qualifications are approved, I should be put in a pool where if I don't get the job in the Department of Agriculture, but maybe the Department of Labor needs an accountant, and they can reach into the same pool to hire me, even though I didn't apply specifically for that job and go through all the process all over again. So there's that point. There's the question of being able to get rid of poor performers, which we need to do for sure. But one way to do that is to extend the probationary period so that you can actually manage people during that process and make sure that people actually do have the qualifications. And if they don't, as in any organization, people ought not be renewed. But then on the other hand, we can understand that people down the line, if they're poor performers, there are ways to manage them and to deal with it. And so the ways of thinking about all this that I think really involve a set of steps that need and have to be taken, but unfortunately may only be possible to build on the debris down the road. But some of this is going to require action by Congress, and then it's going to be, civil service reform again, and Congress is never going to pass anything. The good news is that, and I've talked to a lot of people who have been in charge of managing HR throughout the federal government and who are in charge of handling appeals for people from the federal government. You can't solve everything, but if you could solve 3/4 of the problems that we've got simply by managers managing better and by executives using authority that they've already got, that's not everything, but it ain't bad either. And so we could go a long way toward fixing the civil service, by simply doing what it is that we know that we need to do, but by creating systems that focus primarily on producing better results for Americans.
So, very final question, just a sentence or two. What's your best advice to federal workers who might be watching? Stick it out, resign? How do they survive?
And that's such a terrible question to try to sort through, because the administration has made very clear that it has no particular use for lots of people in the federal workforce. A couple things. One is that these buyouts that are being offered, at least as we're recording this, are really super complicated, very tough, very hard to try to sort through, and it's not altogether clear that what's being offered is legal. So you want to be very careful to make sure that anything you consider is something that's actually going to work, that there's funding to support, and that you're not buying the proverbial pig in a poke.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Don, for joining us
Sure.
today, and we appreciate your
Fantastic,
insights,
yeah.
and we'd love to have you back.
Good. Always good to have a chance to talk, and heaven knows that 15 minutes from now, something new will happen that'll be worth talking about as well. So always happy to come back and talk more.
100%. Okay, take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.